So, hello. If you're here today for a session called Carbon Credits Explained, a corporate guide to net zero, then you're in the right place. So, my name is Finley Johnson. I'm with Mobility Ways, and I'll be moderating today's session. And what we're going to be talking about today is really what carbon credits are, clarify how they work, what makes them effective, and why quality matters more than ever. Some of the key learnings from today include how carbon credits support net zero and emissions reduction goals, what makes good carbon credits and what to avoid, but also where market and regulations are heading. And we're joined by guest speaker Andy Harris of Nature Broking. Nature Broking are a UK specialist in high integrity carbon solutions. And they act as a strategic partner, providing end-to-end support for organizations looking to design, source, and manage premium carbon credit portfolios with a strong focus on UK nature restoration. And Andy is their managing director, where he leads the company's strategic direction. And he's very active publicly in the voluntary carbon market arena, frequently presenting in webinars and thought leadership formats on issues like credit quality, removals versus reductions, and how companies should engage with nature-based solutions. So I'll be handing over to Andy shortly. He'll do a much better job of introducing himself. But before we do that, we'll just quickly run through the format. So the format for today is a presentation followed by a question and answer session. The presentation will be interactive, so you might see a pop-up throughout with an opportunity for you to answer a couple of questions. Please do engage with that. Keep an eye as well on the chat at the bottom of your screen. So if you've got any comments on anything Andy said, it'd be really useful to put that in the chat box. And we've got over 500 registrants for today, so I'd be delighted if you can introduce yourself in the chat, let everyone know who you are, where you're dialing in from. But throughout the session, if you've got any questions, please add those to the Q&A tab, and we'll keep an eye on that and make sure that we get as many of those over to Andy in the kind of closing Q&A, and we'll aim to have you wrapped up for around midday. So now I'd like to introduce Andy. So Andy, thanks a lot for joining us. We're delighted to have you with us.
No, thank you very much, Finley. It's really exciting to be here and great to see so many people joining in and listening to this talk around carbon credits. So absolutely, I'm the managing director of Nature Broking. And if you don't know who we are, if we jump to the next slide, I've got a little bit on who we are. So we are, as Finley says, a carbon credit and natural capital intermediary and strategic advisory firm. We work with both public and private sector organizations, so local authorities, but also private companies, in order to essentially help you meet your strategic sustainability goals through financing fantastic projects all around the world, and particularly in the UK. So that might be net zero, it might be for carbon neutral, or what we used to call beyond value chain mitigation. And we are very much a tailored and premium solution. So we work very much in what we would consider the premium voluntary carbon market, and we work alongside all of our clients on a long-term basis in order to really find the right solution for them. If we just jump to the next slide, I kind of put that in a little bit more context very quickly, just so that we are kind of all on the same level playing field about exactly what we do. So look, as I say, we help you with carbon credits and finding the best possible solutions for you, no matter what it is, sourcing to order and making sure that it's the right quality, the right price, the right location, the right impacts. But really, we're specialists in actual portfolio management, so putting that together into diversified and de-risked portfolios that are aligned to your goals and managed for the long term, be it for delivery today or delivery in the future for a net zero goal. We run due diligence as a service as well on any kind of natural capital project that you're looking at, to support you in understanding all the ins and outs and the transparency and quality and trade-offs of anything. And finally, we work on project financing, so getting fantastic projects off the ground from the off, and that's quite a specific and pretty interesting thing to get stuck into, which a lot of our clients love doing to really engender a sense of stewardship over a project from an early stage. So what are we going to talk about today? I think if we jump to the next slide, that'd be great. Uh, so really today is about three things. It's about level setting on what carbon credits do and what they mean, how they're used, why they're important. And then we'll look a little bit around the drivers, the benefits and out there. And this will touch a lot on kind of the different areas in which you might be engaging with carbon credits and why. So is it regulation or is it more of a internal sustainability driver or all the different areas? And then finally, how? So how do you engage with them? What is a good carbon credit? What's a quote unquote bad one? And how you might go about, I guess, building yourself that more strategic view of carbon credits within your sustainability journey. I think what's critical for everybody to kind of keep in mind as we go through this is that carbon credits are no longer a afterthought, that's something that you really need to be doing, what you would have been doing perhaps at the end of the year, and you go out and you just purchase some carbon credits in sort of without knowing what you're doing. It really needs to be part of a proactive strategy that sits within your wider sustainability and reduction journey. And I say that in a very timely manner around COP, but also around the recent changes that have, or consultation, draft consultation that's out with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, for example, which is forcing companies and encouraging companies to think about it in that proactive way. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about that. I think, however, as Finley mentioned, we've got a bit of a interaction now. So I think there's a poll that might come up. I'm hoping this works. So Rachel, I don't know if you can do that. Fantastic. So I'd love it if everybody could answer this, and it should be on your screen now. And really, this is just to see kind of where we're at. So how confident are you in purchasing carbon credits today? And we'll see what the kind of outcome is before we start. Rachel, you'll have to let me know if you can see any of the results because I don't think I can see any at the moment. But fantastic. There we go. It's popped up. I'm hoping this has popped up for everyone else. If not, I'll start to read this out. So we'll go from the bottom. So if you answered not confident, you are joining 58% of other people. So that's quite a large chunk. Somewhat confident, 36%. Confident, the people who really kind of think they know what they're doing, 8%, and the very confident is the 1%. Wow, that's one person or a few people who've actually answered that, and I promise I didn't answer that. I haven't answered yet on here, so I think we've got a lot of explaining to do, talking to do, and hopefully by the end, when we run that poll again, there'll be some differences, and we'll see. It's a good measure of how well I do today. So we could jump to the next slide. We'll get stuck in. So let's start with the very basics and what a carbon credit is. I think this is a useful way just to ground everybody for the rest of the session today. So quite simply, a carbon credit represents a project or activity that does something to affect greenhouse gas emissions or going into the atmosphere or that are already in the atmosphere. So think around, for example, afforestation. So planting trees. When you plant a tree, it turns carbon that's in the atmosphere into its trunk, its roots, its leaves. That then can be quantified and turned into a carbon credit. Now, carbon credit always equals 1 ton of atmospheric carbon, either removed from the atmosphere or reduced through an activity like afforestation. And there are loads of different types of activities out there that you can do, and we'll talk about that later. But the carbon credit represents that. Now, a carbon credit is simply a financing mechanism for organizations to purchase which finance that activity either from scratch or the ongoing maintenance and monitoring of it and the ongoing expansion of that activity. So you've planted a tree, you've measured the amount of carbon that is, or GHGs that are being sucked out of the atmosphere or reduced by an activity going into it. You've turned it into a carbon credit or a number of carbon credits which represent the number of tons. And an organization then buys that carbon credit. And the organization then uses that carbon credit in order to offset against its emissions. And so you would, as an organization, know what your emissions are. You'd hopefully be on a reduction journey. You'd measure them, you're reducing, and then you're using them to offset. And the financing, buying that carbon credit goes back to the project. So that is quite simply what it is. It is a financing mechanism. So if we could jump to the next slide. So again, a little level set. Let's just talk about some of the jargon that's involved in this in the world of carbon credits. And look, there's a hell of a lot of jargon. There are so many acronyms, and we're always trying to, for some reason, as an industry, create more and more confusion. And I hate it. So I like to just level set. So we've just talked about emissions. We talked about carbon credits. I don't think any of the top three on here will really need talking through too much. But what's really important to understand that not all carbon credits are the same. So that bottom left box is really important to talk about. Broadly speaking, there are three categories of carbon credits in the voluntary carbon market that you need to be concerned about. And they move from left to right in terms of what you would call, I guess, integrity and quality. Now, that is not quite always as simple, broad brush, and black and white as that, but it is a good rule of thumb. So removals being the first, and that is an activity that actually sucks greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So again, planting a tree, that turns that carbon into the tree. Then you've got reduction activities. This is an activity that takes something that has already been done, which is producing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and the carbon credit funds that activity to produce less greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it's really important, really good activity, but not quite removing carbon that's actually in the atmosphere. And then you've got avoidance, and this one can be a little bit of a nebulous way of thinking about carbon credits, but there are a lot of avoidance projects out there. So this is ring fencing something that perhaps is sucking carbon credit, greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere, and ensuring that that doesn't disappear. So it's avoiding future emissions that could happen if an intervention wasn't to take place. So, for example, this would be ring fencing existing forests out there and making sure they're not cut down for timber or for clearing the way for agriculture. So still really important activities, but it's not necessarily changing the quantum of carbon in the atmosphere based on something really, really certain. So it's really important. We'll talk a little about those later and around some actual specific project types. Then in the middle, bottom, in the middle, you've got carbon neutral beyond value chain mitigation. I'll caution that BVCM, beyond value chain mitigation, is slightly is oh, some people can't hear. I don't know if people if there are speaker issues. I'm hoping that Finley, can you hear me? I've just seen that on the chat to make sure that. Okay, I'm going to carry on, and hopefully those speaker issues can sort out. But if there is an issue, just shout, and I'll try and sort something out my side. So BVCM is a term that's slightly moving out of fashion, but basically carbon neutrality. The point of this is you are using carbon credits in order to mitigate all of your impacts. If you are an organization that's producing 1,000 tons of carbon into the atmosphere every single year, you might be buying 1,000 carbon credits to entirely mitigate what you're doing. And then you've got net zero, bottom right hand corner, and this is the critical one. This is what you see governments, organizations, supranational organizations like the EU, all the way down to individual companies talking about and setting net zero targets. And this is central to fighting climate change, and the most important thing. You need to be able to be reducing your emissions as much as you possibly can to become net zero. But the only way to become net zero is also then offsetting any residual emissions you cannot possibly reduce or get rid of. Unfortunately, we're in a world now where we still rely on fossil fuels. I don't know of any single organization out there that can fully reduce all of its emissions. So to be net zero, there has to be no net carbon going into the atmosphere. So you have to offset that last bit you can't get rid of. And there are organizations out there, obviously, like the Science Based Targets Initiative, that help you, guide you, and set the frameworks on how you should set net zero targets, reduce, and then offset. We'll talk a lot about that later. So hopefully that helps a little bit set the framework. If we can jump to the next slide. So what do they do? What do carbon credits do? Where do we sit? Well, if you think about the big things that we're doing to fight climate change and nature loss globally, and I guess prepare for climate change, there are really three things. You've got adaptation, mitigation, and actually undoing, which we often don't really talk about. It's sort of slightly forgotten about. But adaptation would be natural flood defenses or flood defenses, changing cities, making sure that we're actually prepared for the major weather events and climatic changes that are coming and environmental changes. Mitigation is trying to mitigate and stop the effects of the ongoing greenhouse gases that we're putting into the atmosphere to try and slow down climate change. And undoing is actually slightly similar to that, but it's actually reversing the damage we've already done. We often forget that climate change isn't something that's around the corner coming that we're worried about in the future. It's here and it's been here for a while, and there are excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We have hugely damaged our environment around us. The UK, for example, is the bottom 10% of biodiversity intactness globally. So we have to undo that damage as well. And carbon credits really are most impactful when you're looking at that undo and that mitigate side of things. So planting a tree sucks out that excess carbon that's in the atmosphere, but it also mitigates the ongoing carbon that's being pumped into the atmosphere each year by planting more trees and doing all the activities you can do around carbon credits. Having said that, loads of different carbon credit types have fantastic co-benefits, what we tend to call co-benefits. You can think of these around UN SDGs, those UN SDGs that are all around, natural helping the environment, or they might be sustainable cities, or creating circular economies and so on. So, for example, you might help communities or biodiversity intactness and wider environmental health in the oceans and so on through the kinds of projects you can do with carbon credits. So they do have an impact on adaptation. We jump to the next slide. So where do they sit? What's the good headline practice for using carbon credits? And this slide has become all the more pertinent with the announcements in the last few weeks around the Science-Based Targets Initiative's kind of version 2 draft proposal around how their framework works, which is really a bellwether and a leading showing kind of the leading thought on where this is all going. But as I say, you need to be measuring, reducing, and reporting. That is the number one step as an organization, whether you are a private organization and a company, or a charity, or a local authority, or whatever you are, you need to be doing those things. That is fundamental. Measure carbon offsetting, carbon credits doesn't work unless you measure, unless you have a quantum of the kind of carbon that you need to mitigate. You can't really do a huge amount with them, or you shouldn't necessarily be doing. So measure first. Once you're measured, you can do two things. You can start reducing, you can get that plan in place to reduce those emissions down. You can set a really good, robust net zero target, and you can start working towards that. And I would encourage people to be working with organizations like the SBTI and ISO standards in order to do that. But you can also start to mitigate your ongoing impact and start offsetting while you're reducing. Because what that is doing is then making sure that you're not having any further impact from that moment that you've understood your quantum and set your plan in place to reduce that quantum of emissions. So you should be thinking about carbon offsetting as part of this wider strategic sustainability journey and being proactive about it, as I mentioned at the beginning. And of course, you should be reporting. Now, this is becoming even more pertinent again with recent changes to CSRD in Europe, TNFD, TCFD in the UK, around how you need to be reporting on both your reduction journey and your net zero, but also on your carbon offset use and how that is fitting in. And there's now a move towards explaining why you're not using carbon offsets rather than why you are using carbon offsets. So again, SBTI have now changed to that and have said you need to be explaining why you are not using them. So we jump to the next slide. So what does it look like for you? So what does that mean? If we bring this all together and chuck this onto a journey, where do we get to? So every organization, I imagine most organizations on this call are somewhere on this red line. That red line represents your sustainability and reduction journey. You start at the top left, you understand, you've measured, and you're starting to implement your reduction, and you're going down that curve, and hopefully your curve looks something like this, a dramatic reduction in your emissions, all the way down to maybe 10%, which is what you might not be able to get rid of by your net zero year. So you've got a net zero target. Let's say that net zero target is 2035, where that green line is. You're trying to get rid of as many emissions on the way there. What the best practice would be at this point is to go, I am reducing, I know what I'm doing, but also I am engaging with those white arrows. I am offsetting along the way. And you might be offsetting everything, which will get you down to carbon neutrality all along the way, which is fantastic. You're mitigating your entire emissions scope along the way. Or you might say, do you know what, we're going to go piecemeal, we're going to start embedding this carbon offsetting, and we're going to slowly increase it. And we'll start with something like some aspects of scope 1 or scope 2, and we're going to focus on other areas of reduction. That would be the more beyond value chain mitigation, where you're doing some of it. Carbon neutrality is much more around actually getting rid of everything along the way. Then you get to your net zero year 2035, you've reduced as much as you possibly can, but there is still some emissions that you will be putting out every single year because, as I say, there's no business that's not going to be able to do that. You have to be using carbon credits in order to mitigate those ongoing emissions. Otherwise, you will not be net zero and we will still be having a negative impact on the planet. So on the next slide, I guess the headline statement is every company to reach net zero will need to use carbon offsets. And that is not a that is, as I say, a kind of physical fact of the way it works, but also now is very much a recognized fact within the main scientific and net zero frameworks out there. So the drafts consultation, as I say, that SBTI brought out last week explicitly says companies have to have a plan and to be using carbon offsets to offset all of those residual emissions. And they're expected to for all scopes, scope 1, 2, and 3. You will need to be doing that. And they also starting to put in plans to say you need to be offsetting along the way. So those white arrows in the middle. Now, there's some nuances around who, by when need to be doing that, which kind of companies, which size, and by when to slowly ease this in. But it's here. You need to be thinking about this as part of your sustainability strategy now. Can we jump to the next slide? Perfect. So let's talk about drivers, why, benefits, and this is a very high level slide. I mean, what I tend to find when we talk to all of our clients is that everybody's got a particular driver that's nuanced to their business that is it's a myriad of different things, and I'm always surprised by the different reasons and benefits that companies and organizations see in this, which is fantastic. Works well for us because we're very tailored in our approach. So we love to hear about all the different reasons, but you can broadly categorize it into these very high level sort of 6 drivers and benefits. We've kind of talked about that top left one, your net zero journey. So I'll ignore that. That's kind of obvious on the last few slides. Regulation. Now, this is really important. This is becoming a big driver. So I'll talk about this a bit later, but from a top-down level, supranational organizations like the EU, national organizations like the UK government are now regulating this space. So from 2028, 29, the UK government will be incorporating voluntary carbon credits into the emissions trading scheme, into our cap and trade scheme, which is a whole different thing. But that is a regulated market. And if you are an organization that is covered by the ETS, you will now be able to and start thinking about using voluntary carbon credits as part of that. And that is a starter. So this whole market is starting to be pushed and is really critical for you to be thinking that regulation is actually coming down the line to kind of push you into this space. There's a whole bunch of new thinking around TCFD, disclosures, CSRD, as I said, which is asking you to actually talk about why you're not using carbon credits. Same with SBTI. So regulation is a real push, particularly for those larger organizations. Competitive advantage. Now, this is really important because what we typically see is organizations asking, well, how can I demonstrate the great work that I'm doing and actually make a good advantage out of this? Let's not beat around the bush here. This is all about impact, but you are creating fantastic narratives and stories here, which are really important. So, for example, if you are a NHS supplier, we see a lot of organizations putting into the contracts they work with when they work with the NHS to say, well, look, here's how we're meeting our mandated public procurement requirements around environmental benefit and net zero through investing in carbon credit projects that are local in the UK, and that helps them with the tender process. So there's a huge competitive advantage if you get the narrative and the story right here. Employee satisfaction, I won't go into this too much, but actually there's a huge amount of research out there which tells you that you can attract by far better talent if you are a more sustainable company. And this is really a big part of that. One thing that we love to do is bring our clients to the site of our projects. And that is often, we typically see that the leaders of any particular department we're working with in sustainability in our big organizations will actually send their employees along so that they get to go and actually touch and feel engaged with the projects. But that kind of thing is very hard to quantify, but actually has a huge impact on organizations. Cost savings. Now, this is really important. And again, this harks back to this proactivity within how you're supposed to be and should be thinking about carbon credits strategies now. No longer is it an afterthought, as I say, that you're just purchasing at the end of the year. And if you are doing that, you are probably paying more than you could be. You are exposing yourself to price rises and fluctuations. You are also exposing yourself to not getting hold of the right type of carbon credit for the specific goal that you have, either if it's a voluntary goal or a regulatory goal where you really need to have the right type. And if you are intending on using carbon credits and you have a proper net zero goal, if you start to engage with them properly and you start to buy forward, for example, locking them in, building diversified portfolios, you can make significant cost savings on the purchase of those credits. So the benefit to doing it properly, and I'll talk about the mechanisms and doing this later, but having a proper proactive strategy means that you'll spend a lot less overall in your carbon credits. Now, this bottom right one leads on from that and is very noddy. And for any of accountants in the room, anybody who has a deep understanding and love for balance sheets and a P&L, you can now capitalize carbon credits as an asset on your balance sheet. So it removes it as a cost, removes it as from your P&L. It's an asset against the liabilities of your net zero journey and your ongoing commitments. So that's really important because that makes the conversation much easier with your CFO. It makes the conversation much easier getting past your board and your compliance department. Something that Nature Breaking has supported the innovation of, and we're actually doing a lot of announcements about this in a couple of weeks with a key client of ours. But this is a really important innovation within the market. So again, there's a benefit to the way you do it in order to maximize the cost effectiveness and efficiency and impact on your business. Can you jump to the next slide? Right. Sorry. So balance sheets to regulation. This is a very noddy couple of slides, but I promise I'll try and make it as interesting as possible. This is by no means an exhaustive list of regulation that has an impact on the carbon markets and the way that you use carbon credits. But these are some really important ones and some illustrative ones that I think are important to talk about. And I'm looking at kind of different levels and areas that you might be impacted. The ones that are highlighted in the acid green color is have direct carbon credit implications, so they're either directly about them or they have some aspect to them that are really important. And the other ones have, I guess, indirect implications. They are drivers towards or using carbon credits correctly. So from a supranational perspective, the EU is a great place to look for fantastic thinking around this. CSRD and CSDDD, when you're thinking about reporting and talking around the way that you're engaging with your sustainability journey, it's really important to understand that you actually need to be talking about carbon credits now and how you're using them and why you're not using them. And there's a lot of thought and change coming into these regulations coming up around this. There was obviously the omnibus, which has been slightly paused, and there's some rethinking around how they're adjusting these frameworks and which companies are in scope. So there's coming out of this in the next 18 months, there's going to be a lot of change around how you need to be reporting around your offset usage. Article 6 and CBAM, these are directly impacting carbon credits. So if you're using carbon credits, you may find that they have, there's a lot of talk around Article 6, which is around carbon credit transactions between countries and how they're accounted for on nationally determined contributions. But all that is to say, there may be a reason why some credits are more expensive because they actually sit under an Article 6 approved approval, while others that are seemingly the same don't. And so there's a lot of thinking around kind of which ones you're using for what thing and how they interact, particularly if you're a large organization, you'd be maybe more affected by CBAM and Article 6. On a national level, I actually talked about this. So the emissions trading scheme in the UK integrating with the voluntary carbon market. So again, this is going to affect you if you're already part of the ETS, but if any of the ETS expands, that may bring you into scope because you'll start to see voluntary carbon credits as part of the regulated market. But this has already happened around the world. So this has happened in Japan and a few other markets. The EU is looking at doing the same. So we're seeing this tighter regulation around it. TCFD and TNFD, again, similar to CSRD, it's about disclosures and what you're doing with carbon credits. PPN 002 for anybody who's really into their public procurement stuff. So this is the social impact public procurement guidelines. So this actually is all about if you're selling to any public body, you really need to understand your social impact. Part of that is having a proper net zero journey. To have a proper net zero journey, as we discussed, includes carbon credits. But not only that, there's actually requirements for you to demonstrate that you're having impact on local environments, communities, and biodiversity. As I say, there are huge co-benefits to carbon projects when you invest in the right ones. So you can demonstrate really effectively in your public procurement social value requirements that you're doing what you need to do if you're engaging with carbon credits correctly. From an industry level, there's a whole bunch, but I'm just picking out one or two here. So NHS supplier roadmap actually is very similar to the PPN 002. So this is again again, the NHS requiring you to have proper net zero standards and net zero frameworks in place in your organization. And then again, all that implication on the offsetting and carbon credit side. Corsair, you may have heard of this. This is the actual airlines industry offsetting framework. So if you are an airline, you will be engaging with Corsair credits undoubtedly. Again, similar to Article 6, you may find that Corsair credits are slightly hard to get hold of or very expensive because you may have missed the boat on grabbing them because they are hotly in demand and there's a pretty high benchmark on how good quality they have to be. So again, that proactive thinking around how am I going to manage this for the next 10, 20, 30 years as an airline on getting hold of these. Now, this is just two examples, but there's a lot of industry talk around different carbon offset guidelines. If you're actually in an airport, for example, you have the ACA guidelines, which again include carbon credit implications within them. So again, you need to be thinking about it proactively to meet your industry requirements. And then finally, the framework side. Now, the framework side is really important. This is probably the one that touches most organizations. You'll hear me say SBTi a lot more today, but their version 2 that came out in the last couple of weeks is really important to see the direction they're moving in. It's a requirement to have your carbon offsets, be using carbon offsets for your residual emissions post or net zero year. It's also a requirement in the future to be mitigating your ongoing emissions, as we talked about those white arrows that I showed on the graph. And that's been phased as a phased approach on that implementation. But you know, if you don't start sorting it out now, and there are companies out there with big emissions and 2030 net zero targets, they're going to be snapping up a lot of the credits that you're probably going to need in a couple of years' time. So proactively including it into your journey. So there's a lot of regulation out there. This is not an exhaustive list at all. But let's go to the next slide. Right, okay, into the meat of different types of credit. So what is actually out there? What can you use? We talked about those things on the left-hand side, but as a very quick reminder, you've got kind of three types: removals, sucks carbon or GHGs out the atmosphere with the activity. Reduction reduces something that is already putting carbon into the atmosphere, but reduces it to a lower level. And avoidance is ring fencing something or protect something that if that thing has stopped, it would produce carbon into the atmosphere or would stop sequestration. So slightly harder to define. In the middle, I've got, again, a very non-exhausted list of the kind of credits you see out there, but there are honestly hundreds of types of really cool projects, technologies, innovations, and things you can do to create carbon projects. A carbon project is typically, or a good one, will be aligned to a recognized standard organization. So you might have heard of some of these: Verra, Gold Standard, and there's a whole bunch at the bottom here that I've put in. ACR, Climate Action Reserve, so on. There are, again, hundreds of these globally. There will be a recognized scientific and verified scientific methodology, which tells you in detail in hundreds of pages of scientific documents and calculations of how you measure the carbon, monitor it, govern that project. And so that would be, how do you actually knock on a tree and listen and hear how much carbon is in there, essentially, and how do you actually measure it all? That's what the methodology does. And that, again, every project should be aligned to that. And then every project should be set up in such a way that there is, you know, as I say, very strong governance, co-benefits, making sure there's safeguarding and so on. So there's a really big, robust framework around projects and how they're set up. And, you know, the jobs of companies like Nature Broking is to make sure that we've done the due diligence on them to make sure that they're aligning to these standards and frameworks and that they're actually doing what they should be doing from a setup and ongoing governance and monitoring perspective. But in terms of the actual projects that are out there, nature-based solutions are probably the most broadly known and understood and used, and they're fantastic. They have huge co-benefits. So obviously they bring back biodiversity and help the wider environment, but they're often fantastic for local community benefits. You see that in the global south quite a lot, where there's a lot of financing for local communities. In North America, there's loads of fantastic projects that work with indigenous populations for forestry, for example. And in the UK, regenerative agriculture, for example, is fantastic because it sucks carbon into the soil and stores it there, but also creates a more circular food chain, greens our food supply, and also actually can provide kind of extra work and jobs for local communities. So there's a load of different things out there. Looking at some of these, afforestation, forestry, we've talked a lot about that. Rewilding's an interesting one. You're seeing that come up more, where you're just that's what it says on the tin, rewilds land, but again, it's soil carbon, so it's storing way more soil carbon into soil, making soil actually regenerative rather than depleting it, and much healthier, which is really critical. If not, can sound a bit boring boring on the tin talking about soil, but it is actually very interesting, and I can talk to anybody who wants to hear more about that afterwards. And then you've got some more techie solutions, things like biochar and enhanced rock weathering. They sit in between sort of nature-based and tech, where you're taking technological innovations and then using the outcome on land. So biochar, for example, you're heating up biomass to a very, very high degree under low oxygen, and it creates a very sort of raw form of carbon, locking it in, and then you can use that as fertilizer, and it's a very green fertilizer. So it's a really fantastic solution, seeing a lot more of that. And you get your really techie solutions like direct air capture, where you've got big machines that kind of look like air conditioning units that sit outside, and they actually just use chemical processes to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and then store it geologically underground, often is the case. So very high, permanently locked away carbon. So you've got loads of different stuff. They all vary in price, they all vary in, I guess, trade-offs and transparency. Trade-offs, and being transparent on those trade-offs is really important. Blue carbon's worth talking about. So there's not a lot of blue carbon out there. So this is anything in the marine environment, kelp sinking mangroves, there's salt marsh, seagrass, and all sorts of other ones. It's slightly newer, but has huge potential in the future, because it's one of the best ways that we can theoretically sequester GHGs and lock it away for a long time into marine environments. So that's really important. Um, those are all sort of in blue, represent the removals. Now there is some blurred lines here depending on how the project's set up, whether it's purely removals or removals and reduction credits and so on, but largely speaking that's about right. You've got these reduction credits. You often see these sorts of things: home insulation, paying for homes to be insulated more, reducing the number of emissions that come out from homes. And peatland, for example, is classified, peatland restoration, as a reduction credit. And then you've got the avoidance side. So again, these are really important projects. They're fantastic from their co-benefits perspective. Cook stoves are a great example of this. Red Plus is also a really good example, where you're kind of protecting rainforest. So it's really important. Should they be used as carbon credits is another question, and how they should be used is an interesting one. So you really need to think carefully about using these, particularly if you have an SBTI aligned net zero target. You should be you should be questioning how you should be using them, or whether they're going to be ratified for those sorts of things. So we'd always encourage everybody to move in kind of to that bluer space, I guess, the removal side, because they're the most impactful. But that's not to say that there isn't positive impact on communities and co-benefits from all of this on this page. So we jump to the next page, that'd be great. So what makes a good carbon credit? And there's loads to talk about here, and I won't go into all of it. I mean, we ourselves, we run due diligence in-house for our own framework, and it's a 650 data point due diligence assessment we run on all our projects. So again, obviously don't have time to go into all the nitty-gritty, but there are some key categories and elements that you'd want to be looking at and understanding. The thing I will say is there is no such thing as a perfect carbon project and carbon credit. It is like any other thing you might buy, any kind of other asset or anything you and your organization might buy. There are trade-offs, and what the job is when you go in to engage with these with carbon credits is to understand the trade-offs with full transparency and disclosure, and that's critical, and then engage with them in a way that minimizes risk from those trade-offs, which I'll talk about a bit later. But the things you might be looking at here, and the absolute critical ones you might be hearing a lot about, are things like permanence. Permanence is how long is the carbon that's sucked out of the atmosphere or reduced stored away. And that varies massively depending on the type of project you're doing. For things like direct air capture, it is 1,000 year plus or 10,000 years plus, because you're putting it underground into huge reservoirs underground and pumping it essentially into geological storage. But the problem with direct air capture is it has no co-benefits for the environment. It doesn't bring back biodiversity. It typically doesn't help communities in a huge way. So those UN SDG code trade-offs are slightly different. So high permanence, but maybe not so many co-benefits. Whereas if you compare it to something like, let's say, regenerative agriculture, you suck carbon into the soil, and that does get stored for a long time if it's undisturbed, and if it's managed properly, it can be hundreds of years. However, it's harder to guarantee that permanence because you've got humans on top of it, changing the land changing hands and things like that. So guaranteeing permanence is slightly harder, and you're definitely not thousands of years, but the co-benefits are massive. So 70% of all land in the UK is farmland. We produce a lot of food. It's a really important thing for us to do in the UK, for example. So understanding those trade-offs around co-benefits, permanence is really important. Additionality, project developers quantification, this is all integral stuff. But the other one I would bring out is governance. I think that's really important. So how is it actually set up, this project? Does it have the right structures in place in order to make sure that it's going to be there for a long time? Is it well funded enough and all of this stuff? So this is to say, this is the kind of thing you need to understand when you engage with it. So it's really important that you have a team that can do this, or you work with someone that can do this, but making sure those transparencies and trade-offs are there is key. Getting this right will allow you to pick the right thing, and it will allow you to understand if that carbon credit can be used for the right target. So can it be used under a CORSIA or ACA if you're in an airport? Can it be used for SBTI? Can it be used for, if I buy it now, but I'm intending to use it as part of my emissions trading scheme, offsets in 2030? Is that going to stand up? So you really need to get under the skin of it is really important. But it also allows you to make sure that you're aligning to your values more correctly or your locations. So if you say I've got offices around the world and I want to align my projects that I'm investing in to those locations, then what are the trade-offs that I would see on something like this? Is there more reputational risk if I go to a slightly less stable, geopolitically stable country? What's the risk to permanence if I do that, and so on? So again, it allows you to really understand how you're going to develop your I guess, carbon strategy. You jump to the next slide. Oh wow, yes, of course, pricing. Now I won't dwell too much on this, and this is a this is an ever-moving I kind of feast in this industry, but the pricing is quite important to think about when you're engaging with it. Now, the first thing to say is the bottom left, you'll see avoidance and reduction. They typically, because of the way that they are used, particularly avoidance, and I guess the efficacy of the carbon that you're using, you're offsetting the claims you're making with them, tend to be the lowest price, particularly that avoidance side. Reduction can vary a fair bit, but avoidances tend to be the lowest price. All the way on the right-hand side, you typically see the most expensive are technological base removals. So things like direct air capture. Now, in the middle, you then get your sort of, I guess, your bread and butter, your workhorse of the carbon market, which is your nature-based removals. And these are fantastic solutions. This is actually the majority of the removals market are nature-based in terms of volume. And so what we're expecting to see is the price of the right-hand side of this graph come down, because as these technologies scale, we expect the price to come down significantly, because right now the volume of those is very low, but the price is very high because these are companies and scientific methodologies that are expensive to get up and running. But once they do, they have a lot of promise to sequester a lot of carbon at quite a lot of scale. So the price will expect to come down. And those nature-based ones in the middle, while they're very good value at the moment, they're really, really important. They have huge co-benefits and they're fantastic. We expect the price to go up because they're going to be used increasingly by many organizations coming into this space for SBTI targets and so on. And the predicted price is expected to rise quite quickly. So again, the point is make sure that you are thinking about this strategically. Where am I going? What am I going to be doing? Do I need to be buying some more cost-effective solutions now and holding off on some other ones? How am I balancing my portfolio and my thinking when I'm engaging with this? But there's a huge range in pricing. You can even see within the categories, there's huge ranges depending on the way the project is set up and what it's doing. So again, that price discovery is make sure you have someone in your team who can do it effectively or work with someone who can. And jump to the next slide. Right. The smart way to engage with carbon credits. So I've kind of built towards this, and I think this is a really key thing to sort of start to close on. So there's a whole bunch of ways that you can, I guess, engage, and there's more than what's on this page here, but this is the broad categories, I guess, of what you should be thinking about. And again, I'll just highlight this is a strategic imperative now as part of sustainability. This is not an afterthought. So you can engage, as a lot of companies have been, by buying carbon credits today, offsetting today, which is really important. Those white arrows, as I said on the graph. Now this is great. You're offsetting, you're having immediate impact. You're offsetting your emissions and mitigating your emissions today. What that does, if that was your only strategy and your only way of doing it, is exposes you to price volatility each year. You have to be very reactive, so you have to be doing the same process each year. Maybe you're going to tender each year and doing the same thing, and having to have people constantly thinking about, well, what am I buying this year? What am I buying the next year? And you also have supply risks. So you might have an idea that you bought some credits this year and you want to buy them again next year, and next year you'll find that they'll be gone, or as I say, the price might have risen a lot. So there's some trade-offs to doing it very actively like that. So what we're seeing is, and what we're personally seeing with a lot with our clients, is this planning ahead. They're thinking much more strategically, and they're actually buying forward. So they're saying, well, I have a net zero year of 2035. I know that my residual emissions are going to be 1,000 tons, 10,000 tons a year, whatever it is. I'm going to start purchasing those now, and I'm going to make sure that they're going to be robust credits and projects that are going to be relevant and usable then. And I'm going to plan ahead and build it into my strategic journey. And of course, as I mentioned, there's all sorts of ways you can benefit from that. Put it on your balance sheet, capitalize it. You can benefit from cost savings because you're hedging against those price rises. Particularly if you're looking at nature-based solutions, for example, you're locking in the supply. You're also engendering stewardship and partnering with projects for a long, long time, which is really powerful, particularly if they're local and you can go and visit them. So it's a very cost-effective way of doing it. You get the credits released to you as and when you need them. You can think about kind of selling on any that you don't think you need in the end, or purchasing more at the time if you need some more, and so on. It obviously is a bit more complex, and you need to have pretty rigorous plans around it. But this is where the market's moving, not only where organizations and companies are moving, but actually where, as I say, SBTI regulations are all moving to push companies to do this. And the final thing is a portfolio, and this is really critical. We looked at that trade-offs, well, the I guess the circle of different things you're going to look at within a project to make sure they are good and that they are robust and high integrity. But as I say, there are trade-offs and there are risks with any project, like anything you buy. So make sure that you're looking at a diversification, a portfolio, like any other asset. So you want to be saying, oh, maybe I'm buying 3, 4, 10 projects if I'm buying over a course of a long period of time, rather than just one. This not only diversifies your risk because of the different locations they're in and also the different technology types and so on, but also diversifies your impact. You can have those are different kind of fingers and pies in terms of the impact you're having on communities and co-benefits and biodiversity as well. So that's really important, and it could be highly tailored. So we typically work with organizations that say, I have these 5 locations around the world and I want to do 5 projects near my office locations, or we're also running our events over the next 3 years in these locations. Let's align it to those. So you can actually create a really nice tailored solution when you diversify like this. Again, there's complexity to it, and there are minimum volume implications. So you've got to make sure that you're working with someone who knows what they're doing on that. And the benefit of this as well, it's now insurable. So there's lots of insurance products out there, and actually specific companies that have set up to specifically insure these exact things. So you're further de-risking the whole thing through doing that. So yes, there's lots of different mechanisms in order to start building that proactive strategy, which is important. If we go to the next slide. Perfect. Okay. So to summarize, the key takeaways here are: it is about mitigating, it is about undoing. That's what is really important. Yes, there's adaptation aspects to this and co-benefits, but what we're doing here is solving the problems that we are continually creating for ourselves in the climate and the environment, and that's already there. It's fundamental you're measuring and reducing as you go along. That's critical. So for mobility, for example, if you're with your business travel and your employee travel, you need to be reducing those emissions. It's not okay just to go, hey, whatever, I'll just offset everything and never think about this. Yes, be carbon neutral, it's fine. Offset everything that you can't get rid of today, but make sure you are reducing. It's fundamental to net zero to that point. So you need to be thinking about this. If you have a net zero plan and you're not thinking about this, you're sort of falling behind where the market is moving already. So you need to be thinking about it now. Regulation is already here. It's not coming. It is here. It is here in voluntary frameworks like SBTI. It's here in involuntary things, such as reporting in TCFD, CSRD. It is coming very shortly with things like the ETS. So just make sure you're aware of that. There are many types of carbon credits. There are trade-offs, and you need to know, I guess, which ones you want, why, the values, and make sure you're buying the right thing, not just for the impact you want to have or the locations, but also for that regulation side. I mean, making sure you're doing it and it's in keeping with your targets. And there are many ways to do it. And picking the right way will help you be cost effective, but also help you have the most impact, help you make it the most value aligned for you. So there's a whole journey here to think about, and it is more of a strategic piece. Now, I think I've certainly heard enough from myself. I'm sure everyone else has. That's the last thing. So I wonder if we could pull up the poll again, rerun it, and see what people think, and see if I've done a good job. There we go. Perfect. So yes, please answer the same question. I would love to see how people feel again now. I think it was 1% on the very confident and 58 as far as I believe on the not confident. So we'll see how that shifts and hopefully it goes up. Be kind to me. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's moved. So fantastic. So we've gone from 58% to 13% on the not confident, which is great. We've shifted on the somewhat confident. I think we've gone up a bit actually. So we've probably gone from not confident to somewhat confident from I think it was 36 to 48%. That's great. Then we've got loads more confident people. A third of people on this call now feel confident in carbon credits, which is fantastic news. And a few more people on the very, very confident side. So again, I'm probably asking a lot on the very confident from 45 minutes of talking, but it's great to see that some people now feel empowered to go and get stuck in. So that's brilliant news. Well, look, that's everything from me. So I think we're going to do some questions now.
We certainly are. Andy, that was brilliant. Very insightful. Thank you ever so much. We've got about 10 minutes left, and the Q&A is busy. Let's put it that way. So we've got a number of questions. So what I've been trying to do is kind of group them where I can, just so we can get through as many as possible. So I've kind of got a few headers here. And the first one is around kind of credibility, quality, and oversight of carbon credits. And I suppose the context is that recent investigations have revealed that overcounting and underperformance in certain offset projects, especially avoidance schemes, like Cookstones, for instance, at the same time, registries such as Vera have faced criticism over quality assurance. So the kind of headline question, which hopefully incorporates a number of the questions in the Q&A, is how can we, as in the Royal we, rebuild confidence in the credibility and integrity of carbon credits amid kind of increasing scrutiny?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And look, that increasing scrutiny is critical to that, and it's really important. There has been obviously some project scandals out there, like you would expect, I guess, in any market. It's worth saying there are over 35,000 carbon projects and counting out there. Actually, it's probably higher than that. That's what's kind of generally reported in the data, but it's a bit old that. So there are a few big projects that a few years ago had trouble. The ones that tend to get talked about in that world of overcounting and so on is very much in the avoidance space, as the person I think who asked that pointed out. So typically, one of the big ways that we can add rigor to this market, which is exactly what's being done, is, I guess, avoiding avoidance for use for rigorous targets. So this is where we're moving to. Again, SBTI, ICVCM, if you've heard of that, which is, I guess, a global integrity body for carbon credits. Governments are all mandating that you need to be using carbon removals for your targets. Some cases reductions if they are high quality enough. You need to be thinking about more permanent solutions. So SBTI have said 49% of all your carbon credits need to be those high permanence technological solutions. And if not, they need to be super high quality removals outside that. So what you're seeing is the frameworks now in place that are a real true professionalized market that have moved away from the sort of era we saw 5 to 10 years ago of a kind of new burgeoning market getting its feet. So you will not see those problems really coming anymore in terms of anybody who's using credits for any kind of sensible net zero target, for example, because you only really allowed to use the good ones.
Okay. So who's ultimately responsible for ensuring the quality? Is it the buyer, the seller, the certifier?
Yeah, sure. So it's the certification process. So the standard, there is an example of that, but you've got loads of them out there. So they will set the standard of how it's supposed to be done. Then the project will have to be in keeping with the standard and scientific methodology, and then they have to have independent verifiers along the process. They tend to be called VVBs, validation and verification bodies. They're totally independent. They come in and check the homework on a regular basis, monitoring it. So that's kind of your first line of defense against all of this. Your second line of defense, I guess, is people like us. So then when the carbon credit is issued, we come in and we recheck the homework. We make sure that it's low risk. We do a risk assessment. We make sure that we think the project is good enough. And so then that comes in as your sort of second line of checking and verification. Your third line then is how you do it. So it's, have I diversified portfolio? Have I got insurance and so on? So all these ways of making sure that you are kind of making sure these things are good and then defending yourself. And actually, you've even got a sort of zero line of defense now, which is all that regulation I was talking about, kind of setting the frameworks and guidance, both EU, UK, SBTI, and so on.
That probably segues quite nicely. So, if we look at kind of corporate strategy, accounting regulation, global operations kind of complicate, or at least to me, it seems as though they complicate carbon accounting, especially when you've got differing EU, UK, and voluntary market rules. And then, as you kind of highlighted throughout, the tightening guidance from SBTI and regulators. So, I suppose again, headline question is how should multinational companies manage carbon credits kind of across jurisdictions whilst staying compliant and credible?
Yeah, I mean that is a really, really interesting question. And yes, there needs to be increasing alignment. So I'd say it's easy for you, probably if you're in the room right now, if you're a British organization or a European one, there's a lot of alignment between the EU and the UK, so that's great. And then also other countries like Australia and Singapore and Japan. It is difficult if you're truly global. So we see organizations that are really truly multinational doing this with parts of their business. They'll get it. They'll do their European and UK in one way, and they'll do their American in another way, for example. The other thing to say is, and again, harking back to SBTI, you need to be working with your value chain as well. So thinking about you as an organization that has buying power, bring your upstream and downstream partners together and do this in consortiums. We're working with a huge Australian insurer on this with 9 of their suppliers, where they're bringing them together and saying, well, what we're going to do is create one strategy for all of us in one way, which then impacts all of our scope 3 emissions together and makes it a simple, unified approach. So not only are you doing that within your own organization and offices, but you're actually doing that all up and down the value chain. And SBTI have recommended this approach for all scope 3 emissions.
Okay, so moving to kind of market dynamics and pricing future supply, of course, as the demand for removals rises and avoidance credits decline in credibility, I guess, questions will then remain about supply, pricing, market design. What do you expect the carbon credit market to look like, say, 2040, 2050, and how should companies kind of position themselves now?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. 2040, 50 as well. That's interesting because what you're going to see is actually 2030 to 40 is a real hump where the price is going to be high by all predictions, and this has been known for a while because of that lack of supply of quality credits coming online to keep up with the rapidly increasing demand. So you'll see this bell shape basically, where you'll see a lot of prices go up, supply be quite squeezed on high quality. But there's a lot of long-term projects in the ground now. Take the UK, for example, woodland projects, which are only going to start producing credits from 2040 onwards because it takes a long time to grow a tree, but it's going to release a lot of high quality credits from then onwards. So actually, what we'll see in 2040, I suspect, is a lot more engineered solutions because the technology will be mature, the price will have come down, they'll be at scale. You'll see a lot of long-term removal solutions like woodland and afforestation because they take a long time and they're in the ground now, but they're not going to produce credits for a long time. And you'll see the majority of the market will be removals and high quality. In the meantime, there's going to be a long shift towards that, and there's going to be a price and supply squeeze.
Okay, and that, I mean, you mentioned this. For instance, you mentioned trees, and I suppose that is synonymous with offsetting, right? And there was a couple of questions actually I was had an eye on. For instance, there was one around what role peatland carbon code and woodland carbon code play in credible corporate strategies. There was one around why the focus is on trees and not soil, for instance. So I suppose tree planting's long dominated offsetting. And then, but we have soil carbon, peatland restoration, and other emerging technologies like direct air capture, which I suppose will play a part. So how do you then balance that investment? And is it all about trees? What are your comments on that?
Yeah, so it's certainly not all about trees. I use trees as a great example, and it's inherently gettable and understandable. No, so look, if you're building a portfolio, there's a whole bunch of different reasons why you as an organization might have your portfolio look completely different to the next organization in the same industry. But the drivers for you are your values and code benefits and impact you want to have, your price, quite frankly. You're buying a £300 a ton credit or you're buying a £30 one, and your risk exposure. Those are really the big ones. So your values include things like your, locational alignment, but also the impact you want to have. So those sort of the 3 different factors you might look. I think the locational factor this question brought up is interesting because we would encourage, for example, in the UK to be looking at regenerative agriculture because, as I say, so much of the UK is farmland. and it's very intensive. So we should be shifting that. So there's a different impact here that you might have, say, for example, in North America, where there are huge forestry projects that mean that they're very, very high quality and very cost effective because there are massive economies of scale in doing that. So actually, your portfolio might include North American afforestation, UK regenerative agriculture, Scottish, let's say, enhanced rock weathering and direct air capture, because they're fantastic, almost at scale engineered solutions up there, which means that you've got a really nice portfolio that's balanced for risk, location, and price. But your drivers will be different to every other organization. So work with someone who can understand that and build you something bespoke, I guess.
Right. Thank you. We have hit 12, but I've got to cover, I mean, because we've got still got quite a lot of people in the room. So if we'll probably just, if it's okay with you, Andy, just maybe run over 5 minutes if that's not
Absolutely,
a
yeah.
problem. Yeah.
Works for me.
So just to kind of move over, we've got kind of two more topic areas. So kind of sector specific, because there was a few questions coming in on specific sectors. And so I suppose, you know, I suppose these pathways can vary wildly by industry. So having that sector specific opportunity or looking, through a sector specific lens for valid credit generation and purchase is key. So without kind of going into each individual sector, could you at least broadly explain how different sectors and projects types meaningfully engage in the carbon credit market?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's a really good point. So two camps, right? You've got sectors that are forced to or have a framework that's actually in place about carbon offsetting. I talked about Corsair with airlines and the ACA with airports, for example. So those sorts of sectors, they tend to be heavy industry sectors as well, have some impact where you actually need to understand the regulation. Maybe it's the net zero building standard, for example, for property developers. Those will dictate slightly on the kind of thing you shouldn't be using. The ACA, for example, dictate pretty much high quality removals that are aligned to the ICVCM principles. So you need to understand those. Then on the other side, when you haven't got those sorts of things in place, there's what we tend to see as sector drivers around where they can vary massively. So take the sports sector, which we work with. If you're working with a sports club, they actually really want to talk to their locality and they want to talk to their fans. These fans who are going to the same stadium every Saturday to watch the same football team, they want to walk past a project. They want to know that something within their city is actually being affected by the stadium and the team that they're investing in. So there's a great kind of messaging there. If you're looking at sectors that have huge scope 3 emissions, let's say financial services, they may actually, their drivers may be more working with their supply chain in order to mitigate their emissions through projects, but that might be then looking at, well, what do their suppliers want and what are their suppliers like, so what the value is there. So there's lots of different sector drivers. Again, it's similar to what type should I buy. It's, well, what sector are you in? There'll be different drivers, and understand the regulation that's there and coming, but if there isn't, understand what I suppose are the motivating factors of other organizations that you're working with, and your customer base, I guess.
Okay, brilliant. And just to kind of conclude then, moving, I suppose, to the conceptual ethical considerations. So, it's increasingly a politicized kind of arena, particularly, given everything that's going on externally at the moment. And critics often argue against, or at least, forgive me, they argue that offsets risk delaying real decarbonisation. I think you touched a lot in your presentation about reduce, report, and perhaps just do this concurrently. But there is still that question around, credits mobilize, how it mobilizes investment in global mitigation. And I suppose what would you say is a bit of a takeaway is the appropriate role of carbon credits in the broader climate transition? And I mean, I don't expect to get an unbiased answer necessarily, but how are they helping or hindering the process?
Yeah, sure. No, that makes sense. But look, I came into the carbon credit market because I thought that they were a good thing, not the other way around. So look, they are fundamental to, as I've said, to actually us sucking the excess GHGs that are out the atmosphere. So they're fundamental to climate change and mitigation ongoing. We're still, I think GHGs are still growing by 0.3% a year in terms of emissions. So we need to do something about that 0.3%, even if nothing else. So they are fundamental. In terms of how they knit into your reduction and so on, and whether they are seen as something that disincentivizes a reduction. That probably was the case 5 to 10 years ago, because carbon credits were so cheap and there was little scrutiny on reducing, that actually they were a good alternative. That is not the case anymore. Carbon credits are more expensive than they used to be, particularly those high quality ones. But the critical thing is now the regulation and frameworks that are in place around your reduction journey. So you have to be reducing if you're a credible company with a credible net zero strategy or any kind of sustainability strategy. You need to understand that. And now you're being pushed to say you must be reducing, and you really should be investing in these sorts of projects, these carbon credits, in order to offset your ongoing emissions and your residual emissions. But that critical, you must be reducing as well. So they fit in alongside, they do not replace. Now, what I would say is as well, if you set yourself a sensible internal carbon budget and price per ton of carbon, you'll find that that you can get yourself sensibly priced carbon credits to fit within that, but at the same time, it also matches up nicely with the cost of your reduction, the amount you're investing in reduction. No longer should you be buying £2 of carbon credits and finding that's an easier option than spending £50 a ton of carbon on your internal budget. They're starting to level out a little bit and make sense to do both.
Well, I think we did have a few questions around pricing. I think we've probably pushed it our limit now on timing. Thank you ever so much. There's still a lot of people in the room, so it's clearly a topic that our audience are really interested in. So Andy, look, I'd like to say thank you ever so much for giving up your time to talk to our audience about this today. Thank you all of you for attending. Any questions that we weren't able to get through, because there were a lot, we're very sorry that we weren't able to do that. Andy, perhaps we can get those over to you, and if
Sure.
you've got the time, we can maybe get some answers directly to those people who asked them. Trust all of you found this valuable, insightful. This recording will be emailed out to you after today, and it will also be on the Mobility Ways YouTube channel, so you can access it anytime in the future. Share it around your organization to get some kind of get that conversation going internally. If you want to contact Andy, I think the slide's still there. If not, please do so. Andy, your email address is
So as you go for it, it's andyharris@naturebroking.com. There you go.
terrific. Thank you so much. And if you want to contact us to reduce your emissions around commuting, then get on the Mobility Ways website as well. Quick to mention is that our next webinar coming up is Transport for Humans, and we've got an SBTI webinar as well. Get on the Mobility Ways Eventbrite. All of the details will be there, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank you ever so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.